last year, the topic for our Bordeaux summit was collecting in the time of COVID with a focus on Bordeaux. And it all happened in April prior to the launch of the Primeur campaign. And we really didn't know what was going to happen. There was thoughts that it might be postponed till October. There was even some consideration that it might be put back an entire year, and thus changing the whole concept and application of the Primeur system. As it was, it didn't. It went ahead. It was very successful. But of course, it was affected by the pandemic. Now, 2020 has, in its own way, been affected by the pandemic for sure. And whilst I'm sure it will be impossible not to touch on some of those issues, we're moving the focus for this evening's summit more to sustainability. And also in that regard, climate change. Once again, 2020 is the third in a trio of solar vintages where really the effects of climate change are being felt. So we do want to focus a bit on this first panel on sustainability and climate, but this is sustainability which also takes into account, as well as environmental sustainability, economic and social as well. After that, Nathan is going to take us through a brief comment on what sustainability means as an investor, as a wine lover, and for businesses like Honest Grapes. And then we will turn to our last panel, where we will discuss the importance of Bordeaux in the wine collecting firmament today, and look at how important it is to yourselves as attendees this evening, as wine lovers, and how important it is, of course, to us as merchants and to those involved in the trade, not least, of course, the Chateau owners. So that's as rapid as I've ever done an introduction. I certainly won't speak as much for the rest of the evening. But now I would like to move over to our first discussion of the evening, focusing on sustainability. And just for the interest of our panel, I'll mention some of the feedback from our survey. We had over 100 people complete this, so we've got some interesting data, and I'll just share a couple of the key bits of analysis with you. So we had 43% of our survey respondees, when answering the question, do sustainability credentials of a chateau influence your Bordeaux purchasing decision, 43% said yes, and 38% said sometimes. It'll be interesting to see how this evolves over the coming years. The next question that was of note was, in your day-to-day purchasing, what importance do you place on the company's use of sustainable practices? We had 48% said quite, whereas very or moderately were around 18 to 20%. So clearly, the issue of sustainability, the challenge is becoming increasingly important for consumers. So perhaps, Nicolas, if I could turn to you first now, how is Bordeaux adapting to the need for sustainable practices? How are you adapting personally at the chateaus?
Yeah, thank you. We are moving forward, of course. I'm probably part of a generation of transition. My parents or the generation before were probably not very aware of this type of things, and our sons are extremely involved in this type of things. So we are the generation, we have to change things. And of course, it's the future. After, it's a question of who, how, with how long that will take, and which money you put in that. Because, of course, nobody will say that is not interesting in. Nobody say that it's not the future. It's the way to do it, and finding the right balance to go little by little, step by step, to be sure of what we are doing. So that's taking time, and it's a global decision of the chateau. All the people have to be behind this type of decision.
And practically, what does that mean for you? What are you actually doing in the vineyards, in the winery? What sort of in the last 5 years, for example, how have some of the things that you're doing changed?
Yeah, so you were speaking before about climate change. So of course, the global warming has a real influence on all what we are doing in terms of viticulture and winemaking. But if we really speak about sustainability, most of the people put the focus on the treatment in the vineyard, but it's just a small part of the game. We can speak about water, how we manage that. We can speak about the soil. We can speak about all the effluent, we have to think about everything. For example, we are building on the right bank a new viticulture center, and it will be the first viticulture center certified with high quality in terms of environment. So everything we are moving forward in that, and it's a lot of big or small decision.
Very good, very good. Thank you, Nicolas. And Gavin, I suppose, turning to you, in your journey around Bordeaux, when you have been talking to other winemakers, when you've been tasting wines from the vintage, what else have you heard? And again, to Nicolas's point, with regards to 2020, how are you seeing things change at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, some people are very vocal about it, and some people are quite quiet about it. Really, so as to viticulturally name drop, you can't get better than this. I was tasting at Lafite this afternoon, and their 2021 will be their first vintage in organic conversion. So part of the vineyard has been organic, and 2021 will be fully organic. But I had to sort of dig that out of Eric Kohler. He wasn't very forthcoming over that. So you sometimes have to dig. But yes, it's a very present issue, for everybody, for sure. But I agree absolutely with Nicolas. It's not just the treatments; it's everything else, for sure.
It has to be a sort of a holistic approach. And do you think that winemaking, conventional or moving towards organic, biodynamic, was thrown into particularly stark relief by the 2020 vintage? Has that thrown up specific challenges that need to be countered?
I think it was, I should imagine Nicolas will agree with this. I think very much the 2018 vintage was the one we're seeing. One of the things I ask people this year, it's the same as in 2018. I used to ask this question before all the time because I'm a bit of a geek, and I would always ask about the rendement, the yields of different chateaus. And I think 2018, and again, perhaps Nicolas can verify this because he speaks to lots of people who come and taste. But for me, 2018 was the one where it was absolutely eye-watering in terms of the different yields. I think we all know that Parma had really, really low yields. We all know that Ponte Cane had really, really low yields. And for me, the stark one was the brothers in Margaux at Brancantenac. And Henri Leton made a fantastic 2018 Brancantenac, and I think it was around with what you could conventional viticulture, but very much looking to not lutte raisonnée, whatever, very, very sort of controlled viticulture, but conventional viticulture. And I think he made around 44 hectolitres a hectare at Brancantenac, and next door his brother Gonzague made about 6, I think, at Fort Vivens. So you can imagine the sort of cheery chat around a Sunday lunch, maybe in the Leton family, I don't know. But really, when you went from one vineyard to another, and it's not just about organics. I remember, for example, Véronique Saunders at Aubailly talking about very low yields because of some of the aspects of they were not organic then in the vineyard, and they made quite low yields too. So it's not just about the everything, but certainly in terms of yields, certainly we've seen in 2020 and 2018, definitely with we've seen now several years of wet springs and then famously dry summers. And I think it started really with 16, but that was not so much mildew pressure, but definitely mildew pressure in 2018 and again in 2020. 2019 was another vintage of a wet spring and then a dry summer. But the real pressure was 2018 and 2020. And you're really seeing it. And you're seeing for sure in 2020, I think it's not something that winemakers and directors and owners want to talk very much about because they want to present their wine. But the yields and the production levels are very significant, and how much that impacts their view of how they price the wines and so on. But certainly a question of many of them will be managing disappointments in their allocations, I think. And that's a lot to do with the treatments and viticulture, for sure. You'd have to ask whether I'm right with that, Nicolas, but that's just my view.
Nicolas, would you like to come back on? Yeah.
Completely agree with you. The impact on the hill is quite strong, and it could be in conventional viticulture or organic management. If I take my example this year at Rauzan Segla in Margaux, I'm doing a small 30 hectoliter per hectare, 100% organic management. And I have neighbor doing the same volume with conventional viticulture. So it's not just a question of treatment. It's the shape of the vineyard, the type of soil you have, how they react. If you have a very homogeneous vineyard or if it's much more like a patchwork or mosaic. So it depends on thousands of things. But I think the important point is to understand that everybody is going in the same direction. Everybody now is going that way. There's probably few couple of chateaux like Irréductible, Gaulois, who are not following that direction. But most of the people are going that way. Little by little, everybody with his special speed, and it's the future. Probably the main difference is on communication. How do you speak about that or not? Are you doing that because you're convinced of what you're doing and you're doing that for the next generation and the way you manage your vineyard? Or are you doing that because it's a tool on communication? It's if I may, it's extremely fashionable to speak about the insect, to have a big hug with the pigs you are growing in your vineyard or this type of thing. It's trendy, and it's probably more trendy. It's people going that way are the same. We're speaking about 200% new hook and very small hill for concentration 20 years ago. So it's like a little bit excessive comportment on the communication and using these type of things. But I think we are going. For example, I'm managing my free property 100% organic, and we are not making noise about that. It's just because we consider that it's good to do it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nicolas. And I think, funny enough, that leads us on to a point I wanted to ask you, Chloe. So, looking at the communication of sustainability and looking at the market, how important do you think it is to consumers? But also, how much would you say it is heartfelt from the producers, and how much is a response to the market demand that you're seeing for more sustainable practices in wine?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, and something that's been particularly noticeable, I think, for the last two vintages, where, since last year's en primeur kind of put Bordeaux back on the map, so to speak. There's been this sort of refocusing on kind of individual chateau and focusing in on the stories that they have to tell, as opposed to, just looking at Bordeaux as a whole. I think to your first question, for Bordeaux to continue to be as popular as it has been historically, sustainability, as Nicolas said, it's not an option not to be involved in it, because consumers are becoming more and more aware that it's something that is possible. And even though, Bordeaux as a region, I think, is somewhere where it's not the easiest thing to do, in order to catch up really with other top fine wine regions, the Bordelais have the power and are proving that they can go in that direction. I think, because it's something that is relatively difficult to do in a region like Bordeaux, you can't really mask behind a communication strategy at the end of the day. I think it's a big commitment financially, it's a big commitment in terms of time. And the Chateau, who are really committing to it, just can't do it in any way that's superficial. I think it's interesting to see a pattern of more and more Chateau going in the direction that you've chosen, Nicolas, to actually just not really talk about it at all, because it's something that's almost a given. And I think if we, look 10, 15 years ahead, there are even 1 or 2 restaurants in the world these days who will not take a wine that's not created organically. And I think that's something, it's a phenomenon that's going to escalate. So yeah, I think from a communications point of view, if it's not fairly obvious now, in terms of the Chateau that are maybe using it as a communication device, it will be in a few years' time.
Thank you, Chloe. And I think there was an interesting comment or question here from Claire, which I think is very relevant to that analysis there in terms of how difficult it is in Bordeaux, how expensive it might be in Bordeaux. Claire's saying, if you have an expensive vineyard, then the concept of not using pesticides, for instance, is quite threatening to yields and your bottom line. If you're in charge of a cheaper vineyard, the premium from being seen to be organic may well be worth it. Does anyone on the panel have any comments to that?
Well, perhaps I can answer as a premium vineyard, and Nicolas can answer on the cheaper vineyard.
Perfect.
Rauzan Segla. So that's our British sense of humour, Nicolas. Sorry. Well, one thing I would say is that people often misunderstand it with the word pesticide and so on. I sort of, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's really 3 things that we're talking about here. You've got pesticides for the nasty little moths and other things. And then you have fungicide, which is really what you use for treating against mildew. And that is that's really the big thing that we were talking about, say, for example, in 2018, the threat of mildew. And then there's herbicide. So there's sort of 3 different elements in terms of the sides, the stuff that you use. So that's the important thing. So I think for definitely for us, I just showed, can I show a picture of my tractor again? Because this has just been delivered. This is really important, obviously. This has just been delivered. A tractor and a sprayer, that's 90,000 euros worth of kit on a massively long lease. I'm not showing it on the screen, but as I said, that's really for our treatments. And for a small vineyard like ours, at 25 hectare, making 25 hectares, with a few other hectares on lease, making Bordeaux Blanc, Rosé, and a Bordeaux Superior. It's quite an expensive investment. Certainly, we need an extra member of staff, for sure, an extra tractorist. So for us at our level, it's a big investment. And really, what I think we're talking about with the communications and the top chateaus moving towards certainly more sustainable viticulture, whether it's organic or biodynamic or just more sustainable practices. Certainly, really, we're talking about the top wedge of the pyramid of Bordeaux for sure, and it's a much tougher gig at the bottom end in terms of, I don't know if you know the bulk price of Bordeaux, but it is on the floor at the moment. So these are quite big investment decisions across the board. But yeah, for sure, big issue for smaller vineyards.
I think
in terms of notoriety,
it's a big issue for everybody. And just to jump on what you were saying, just to be clear, but I think that everybody understands that when we speak about treatment, everybody is doing treatment, organic or not, but it's treatment always. So if we speak about herbicide, globally, nobody uses anymore for more than 10 years or 15 years. Nobody uses anymore herbicide in the main part of Bordeaux. This is one thing. If we speak about for the fighting the insect, we mostly use sexual confusion using pheromone. We spread in the vineyard, and it's not using any product. And after we speak about the fungus, the problem we have with mildew mostly, we all do treatment, organic or not. And what's important to understand, and it was I was saying at the beginning, it's a global thing we have to see here. Because if you use product you can buy in the industry, you will probably in a normal year get out 3 or 4 times to do treatment at the right moment with the right doses. If you're going out with organic product with mostly cover, you will get out 10, 12, 15 times. You have to go much more often outside in the vineyard. So the compaction of the soil is higher. The use of gasoline for the tractor is higher. Your carbonic, bilan carbone, the production of the carbon is higher too. So it's a question of balance, and it's not black one side and white on the other side. So that's why we have to work hard and deep during years and years to be able to find the best balance to manage the vineyard on the greenest way, but of course producing and finding the good way to do it. It's a tough topic, but it's not just in Bordeaux, except a couple of vineyards where there's no humidity and no disease, like what you can have in Mendoza in Argentina, in some vineyard in Spain. But for the others, it could be Burgundy, Champagne, Hus, a lot of vineyard in Italy, Germany. We have to fight against the disease, and global warming or not, it's a permanent fight year after year, and we need to find the great way to do it.
Thank you, Nicolas. I think we'll draw this panel to a close now, because I'm keen to move on to Bordeaux, the vintage and the market subsequently, but also we have a caesural pause now, and Nathan will give us some brief thoughts broadening the topic of sustainability, I think, talking about how this really refers for wine lovers as investors, and to wine businesses or businesses generally like Honest Grapes. So Nathan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom. I think a couple of really interesting reflections on what Chloe, Gavin and Nicolas have said. First of all, a couple of really important things. I loved what you said, Nicolas, that there's a generational change going on here. And we see that so much in the producers that Tom and I and Honest Grapes work with around the world, that there's a generational change in people who are drinking wine, and a generational change in the people who are producing it. And we have a little phrase that Tom and I use, with all due deference to yourself and Gavin, which is older vines, young winemakers, okay? Because it's really important to think that sustainability isn't the same thing as organic or biodynamic or another label. And particularly in a wet maritime area like Bordeaux, just saying, okay, I'm going to be organic tomorrow and stop using this and that, doesn't take account of the weather system that you're living in, overlaid with the change of climate within the region. So it's important for us as consumers and as collectors to realise that the labels that are applied to different categories of wine, we have to think about what's good in wine, not just the label on it. But Nicolas, I loved your comment about that sort of generational change. I think it's also really interesting to reflect of the proliferation of categories of high environmental content and so on, names that words that people are using to say, I'm not organic, but I'm taking care of I'm taking care in the vineyard and the winery. And that's important, but it's also confusing to us as collectors. So there are lots of important issues around sustainability. But I wanted to start to give 3 observations, really. First of all, as a collector, secondly, as an investor, and thirdly, as a wine club. As a collector, I think for too long we've treated wine in a different way than we have food. We care about the food we eat and its provenance, but yet we've been prepared to accept a bottle of wine and just drink it and not take so much account of what's within that. And I think that's changing. I think that thrilling wine, though, matters far more than fancy labels and badges. Sustainable and words like organic or biodynamic have in the past had bad connotations almost. They've had the connotation of rusticity or lazy or don't care, whatever. But actually, it's about stewardship. It's about the way in which people growing grapes and producing wine think of their land as a sustainable thing that will be there for the next generation to look after, rather than just a crop to get the maximum yield out of each year. But also, I think, and I know, Tom and I have found this very much with the strong selection we make of wines for our club, that there's now a strong correlation between sustainability and quality. Whatever the marketing machine says, there's something interesting in not just in the story of the wine, but in the wine as you actually taste it, when it's made with that. It is this sort of extra care that's taken by people in producing the wine. So I think there is a strong correlation now between sustainability and quality. And the really fascinating thing then, when you're looking for wines to collect, is that in fact the old vines, young winemakers thing, the improvement of technology and improved technical production of wine means that in a region like Bordeaux, you can even make good wines out of a mediocre vintage. So we substitute the variability of quality for variability that's caused by the increased number, as Tom was saying, of solar years, the drought or the lack of production we're going to have in 2021 as a result of weather or climate systems causing frosts and things like that, but also the variability amongst different crops in different regions. In Burgundy, for example, Chardonnay was more affected than Pinot Noir in the recent frosts, and that's to do with the nature of the grape and also where it was planted within the region. So it's quite complex, it's quite interesting. But in fact, as a collector, the overall and most important thing for me is that there's much better wine to collect now than there was 20 years ago. Technically, it's better wine that is made better and will last longer and is more thrilling. And that's no disrespect to your forebears, Gavin and Nicolas. It's just the facts that technology has improved winemaking. As an investor, sustainability, I strongly believe it's not just about the environment. It's about sustainability of people, sustainability of teams, and it's also about economic sustainability. There's no use being pure of heart and having lots of lovely environmental credentials if you don't have a business that works and can produce wine in the next years and generation. Whilst ESG, or environmental, social and governance criteria in technology and investing, are faddish, we can't disregard the increasing importance of climate change in public discourse. In the last couple of years, both before COVID and during the year that we've just gone through, there's been quite a strong correlation between ESG governance and investment performance. My personal view is that that's quite likely to be a one-off. But in general, there should be a correlation between long-term business sustainability and investment performance. I think a lot of people might disagree with that. I do think the recent correlation is a bit of an artifact, but investors do have their focus and their own principles. And it's really interesting to me, as somebody sort of in the middle age-wise, is that sustainability is definitely on investors' agendas now. It's definitely something that's being talked about. And I've seen investment rounds recently fall apart when entrepreneurs can't justify the ESG, the governance, the environmental, social and governance aspects of their business. Finally, then, in terms of what Honest Grapes is doing as a wine club, I think you've got to be quite realistic here. We're a club selecting wines for club members. We're not a producer of wine, but we can do three things, and it's the things Tom and I have focused on. The first one is to select wine producers with clear credentials in their vineyards and winery practices, but also telling them that we care, because I think there are very good reasons for winemakers to not always talk about what they're doing environmentally, but making it clear that we care means that we're reflecting the trend from our customers and ourselves personally onto the people we buy from. The second thing we do is try and plan our transportation from wineries into the UK and onto our customers in a way that minimises impact. Let's not go into Brexit here, which is a blooming pain, but by planning transport properly and by removing plastics and other harmful things from the supply chain. We're just doing our best to make those miles that bottles travel better. Then the last bit we do is to try and educate our club members, and this summit and the one we had last time is part of that, just to try and understand those impacts. And then I guess lastly, try and avoid gimmicks. A couple of wine firms in the last couple of years, I won't name names, put out statements about, purchasing carbon offsets and things. Anybody who's in this game knows that carbon offsets are the things you buy when you fail to make impact anywhere else. And I think we've got to be realistic about the impact we have on the environment, understand it, and try and do our bit to improve. I think, in summary, it's a wonderful time for wine collecting, wine investment. Just basically, my cellar is now full of newer wines because they're attractive, they're going to mature beautifully, and now's a really good time to be collecting wine. But there's a lot more environmental and sustainability issues around wine than I think people recognised a few years ago.
Thank you, Nathan. Plenty to digest, and maybe some comments there that our panel will want to revisit, and some comments beyond the cynicism noted by Claire there, Nathan, for the first part about labels. We'll move to our second panel now, and we're moving the discussion more onto the market for Bordeaux, the market specifically for the 2020 vintage, and I'm gonna ask Chloe a few questions shortly, but again, I thought I'd just mention a few of the statistics and some of the data that we compiled through the survey to inform this. For the question, do you buy fine wine for immediate consumption, collecting for future drinking, or for investment? 34% of our responders were future drinking, 30% collect for future drinking, but like to know its value for fun or in case I might sell someday. 22% were for immediate drinking and 12% were for investment. Another question was, is Bordeaux becoming more or less important part of your fine wine portfolio? 47% said about the same, 29% said less so, and 23% were more or even much more. And finally, with reference to the 2020 vintage, given the current global situation, how will your Bordeaux and Primeur purchasing change for 2020? 55% will be buying the same amount, of course, dependent on price, but 25% will buy less. Nobody is looking to buy more. So, Chloe, taking and throwing that data at you, first time you've seen it, but I mean, looking at the market now for fine wine, where does Bordeaux fit in that? What are you seeing? Where are you seeing changes and movements?
So, what's been really interesting throughout COVID, just to touch on that firstly, is that all wine regions are seeing phenomenal price growth and interest compared to what they were seeing beforehand. So it's almost going against what one might expect in a sort of global crisis situation. Fine wine is actually doing extremely well. And Bordeaux within that, partly because of the resurgence of everyone, suddenly being more interested in wine, but also I think off the back of last year's On Primeur campaign that was really very successful, all things considered, is that Bordeaux is kind of in this period of resurgence, and it's been interesting. Obviously the campaign has not really started as yet. There are obviously a few key wines that have come out, and the next few weeks will really tell the full story. But demand so far that we've seen and the way that the campaign is playing out is strong. And I think on the sort of politics of pricing, what people should take into account is, not just looking at the prices compared to what's being released in the same classification or in the same day, but specifically around what that property alone is doing. And I think, Bordeaux in the context of fine wine over the past, 5 years has maybe, it's probably no secret that it's sort of stopped being cool, if you like, for a lot of collectors. It's all about Burgundy because Burgundy is such, tiny production. There's so much demand for it. But Bordeaux as a region tends to be, from my experience, where everyone who's interested in fine wine starts, and a lot of the time where they come back to at the end of their sort of buying cycle. If I think that, there is this sort of classicism around it, which in today's sort of trendy wine environment might not give it such a good reputation. But I personally never ever stop buying Bordeaux, because if you look at it in the context of fine wine, it's incredibly good value. It's the best value fine wine region out of everything that you could be buying for the quality that it presents. And I think from just going back to sustainability, now that Bordeaux and so many properties are genuinely investing heavily in what they can do in the vineyards and outside in sustainability, that will only sort of proliferate, really.
Thank you. So
do you mind if I'm just jumping on that? Okay, so I just want, I have few comments to share here. First of all, about Bordeaux regarding other wine region. I'm not Bordelais. I'm not from here. I started working in Bordeaux 6 years ago. I was born in Provence and traveled all of my life around the world, and so I'm more. I can say that easily. Bordeaux is a fantastic wine region, and I'm not saying that because I'm from here. It's the alpha and omega in terms of wine. You have everything here. We all love Burgundy. We all love the wine from the Piedmont or whatever. But Bordeaux is here from ever and will be there. No other wine region has so much fantastic terroir in such a small region, producing fantastic wine. So of course, Bordeaux is classic, and Bordeaux is the wine you want to kill as you want to kill your father up to a point. You don't want to, if you're a trendy sommelier in a wine restaurant today, it's not fashionable to offer a bottle of Bordeaux. You have to go for a vin nature from Le Jura or something like that. But when things
Canon,
are moving, sorry?
Unless it's Canon.
But everybody is coming back to Bordeaux up to a point because you have fantastic terroir here. And of course, it's not just Bordeaux. It's about Grave, it's about clay, it's about limestone, it's about different exposition, different type of working. And a lot of people are working hard here to develop Bordeaux. So we have 1 foot in the past, 1 foot in the future. And it's a real fantastic region. And if we speak about the global warming and in 2020, I think I take that as a chance, if you want my point of view, because 20 or 30 years ago, 80% of the vintage were not ripe in Bordeaux, and we were fighting or trying to pretend to find the ripeness by chaptalization. But chaptalization is a way to increase the alcohol, but never the tannin structure, the softness of the structure of the wine. The good thing about today, we have that very ripe structure, and if us as viticulture and winemaker, we are able to break the ripeness, to keep the freshness, to keep the precision, we have fantastic wine. It's much more easy to have a fast horse to break than to try to have a donkey to run fast. So we have the chance to have the ripeness. So now breaking that and keeping freshness is fantastic. And 2020 is a good example. We some of us produced fantastic wine this year.
I love that analogy, Nicolas, I have to say. I will remember that one for sure. Breaking a fast horse and trying to whip a slow donkey to speed up. That's very good. I think just one of the questions that we had on the general sale of Bordeaux, and we'll return to the vintage, specifically 2020 after that. But it came up last year, of course, because we didn't know what was going to happen with the Bordeaux releases. Does the panel feel that the current en primeur system, as exists, is still the right way to go about promoting the Bordeaux vintage? Maybe, Gavin, a word from you on that, because I know you said previously you don't have a horse in the race when it comes to en primeur, so you can be neutral, and then we'll turn to Chloe to have some thoughts on what the market wants, and then Nicolas from the Chateau perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think last year, I can't remember what stage we were at. It was just before the campaign, and I think I was saying, "Oh, what are we doing? Having a campaign, in lockdown?" And I was saying, "Delay the thing. Let's taste the wines when they've come to the end of their élevage. Let's move it on a year or whatever." And then I got on the phone because I was writing an article or whatever, and I got on the phone to Ronan Laborde. Again, I'm name dropping here, but the president of the Union de Grand Cru. A terrific guy, and he said, Gavin, it is in the DNA of the Grand Cru of Bordeaux to have en primeur. There is nothing you're going to do to stop it. And so now, whenever people say, "Oh, it's this or that or whatever," I think the Bordelais proved last year that you can really run a successful campaign and reignite interest in Bordeaux. I've been here 20 years, and everyone over the last 20 years has had comments about en primeur, left, right, and centre. And of course, it's had failings, and I find it very frustrating. But for example, last year when I said, "Why are we having an en primeur campaign?" and then the prices came out, I bought a ton of 19s personally. I mean, I bought tons. I mean, I'm gonna have a cellar. Absolutely. If you ever come in 10 years' time for a blind tasting at Château Bauduc, you could guess, "Oh, I think this is 2019." I mean, because I'm gonna have a ton of this stuff. The prices, as Chloe was saying, I mean, some of the prices that come out have already come out. I mean. And you look at sustainable practices and everything else. I mean, Lafon Rocher, what is wrong with Lafon Rocher in terms of the quality and the price is fantastic. It's not you're not going to make money out of it, but it's just incredible value. That is one of the wines that I bought last year because I thought it tasted fantastic. And so, of course, I think there are going to be big issues. We'll talk about 2020. There are going to be big, because you can't suddenly just, Pontet Canet almost exactly this time last year coming out 31% lower, and you're going, and suddenly it was like, oh, okay, now we're talking. And that was already lower, if you remember, way down from the 2016 price. So yeah, Pontet Canet, but you can't do that again. So there's going to be some realism in the market, and it's a totally different marketplace, I think, now in terms of Christian Seeley saying today about optimism, not euphoria, but optimism. So it's going to be a different thing, and I think it's going to be much more challenging campaign, especially for a lot of the chateaus with lower volumes. But whatever we say about en primeur, we're not going to change it. We're not going to change the system. We can talk all we like about the reality of the samples or the system or whatever, but we're not going to. It's not going to. Nothing I can do to stop it. I'm not. We're not going to do we could sit here like a King Canute. I mean, it's a waste of time. Just carry on with it. I don't know what Nicolas thinks, but I can't believe that Rauzan, Segla, and Canon are going to do it.
Well, Nicolas, before we turn to you to get your thoughts on the system, and I'm sure you want a wholesale, complete change of the system, and you just sell direct to individual members here. Chloe, maybe looking at the market more broadly. I mean, Bordeaux is quite unusual in releasing so far in advance of the wines being ready to drink or even bottled, frankly. I mean, do you see this as being anachronistic? Do you think it's something, as Gavin suggests, we'll continue with? And what is the public perception of the validity of this process?
So I think actually from the sort of latest analysis that Wine Lister have done, the kind of public opinion is extremely divided, but leaning very, very slightly towards en primeur still being effectively worth doing and worth buying. So, not euphoria, but gentle optimism, as Gavin said. I think you're absolutely right. I can't see it changing at all. I think it's going to continue to stay the same. I think the phenomenon that we saw last year with such a condensed campaign, I mean, the majority of the campaign happened over a period of 3 weeks, which is, basically a third as long as it usually is, was that those brands and those wines that were the best known were the ones that just did the best, because there was so little time to focus on anything else. And I think that's possibly one of the great dangers of the system, and the slight irony behind En Primeur is that it's obviously this incredible tool to promote a region as a whole, but then it can, hide some wines that are really worth looking out for. I think from the sort of pricing equation perspective, the idea of buying something and then obviously it being more expensive if you were to wait and purchase it later is, the lines of that are so blurred these days that if the En Primeur system is to continue, it's got to be about more than that. It's got to be about just basically getting the wine down so that you know that you've got it, and it's more, it plays more into the sort of wanting to collect and being interested in the stories as and when they're happening, as it does the sort of pure financial element. But yeah, there are still obviously those brands on the market for which it's if you can get them, it's hugely beneficial to buy them en primeur versus buying them later in the day. And with pricing of Bordeaux now going the way that it is, which is slightly against the grain of what's been happening to it over the past few years, if we're optimistic, that will happen with more brands this year than it would otherwise have done a few years ago, I think.
I think, we have to remember that the distribution is just enormous en primeur. I mean, again, sort of talking to Vincent Millet at Canon Segla, he's got 850 distributors around the world. This is through the Place de Bordeaux, so it's through his négociants, through his courtiers. He's got 850 distributors. He could, I don't know how long it takes you to sell all your wine that you put on the market, Nicolas, but I imagine it's not very long. It's an incredible thing. If your wine is in demand, it's an incredible thing. And then for consumers, I mean, say mentioning Canon Segla, if you don't want to buy Canon Segla, which is a fabulous wine in 2020, by the way, buy the Cabernet. I mean, it's just it's for me, and the second wine too. The market, it's for me. I asked him what the négociant price. For me, I think that's cheap as chips. I mean, I think it's fantastic value. And there are many others. And around the corner, Mene, make a delicious wine. They're fantastic. More slated, maybe different vineyards. Lilian Ladouis, it's not expensive. For me, that's not expensive. And the other thing is, if you don't buy it now, really, when would you buy it? Would you really, that's the thing. That's the problem. I think you go with the momentum of something. And by the way, I'd still go back and look at a lot of those 2019s for some of those buyers out there, because they're still fantastic value. You may not make millions from it, but they're fantastic value.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point talking about, because I think often with En Primeur, we have this tendency to focus on this minute set of wines at the top. And actually, that can sometimes be harmful for the sort of bulk of the wines, not least because they sort of, it's easy to ignore them, but also because at the top you're thinking, well, if I buy this en primeur, I'm not going to open it for 30 years, where, the tendency of even just the style of the wine over the past few vintages, if you're buying, 2020 en primeur and you're buying at a level of, 15 to 20 pounds a bottle in bond, you can be drinking that in 5 years and it will be delicious. And it's not quite like, I think, perhaps the 2010s, where even some of the Cru Bourgeois 2010s, you open them now and they still are sort of, huge bombs that you shouldn't be opening yet. So I think even just the evolution of the style of some wines in Bordeaux will actually sort of help eventually the en primeur system to sort of find its feet again a little bit. And
your view as the Chateau representative.
Yeah, I think changing for what? I will put my question here. You know, if you like to go skiing and the snow is good and the fondue has a good taste, changing for what? Going during summertime, there's no real interest. Of course, if there's no more snow and the price are too expensive, you're not going skiing. But if you like it, follow. So it's a question of balance. If you're doing good wines, they are the good value, and people do some money with that, and they are happy to play that game and to be sure to have the wine in the future. It's quite interesting. And I'm back on what was saying Gavin last year. I was extremely afraid about the campaign, and as well was one of the people saying, it's too dangerous to play that game. It's not the moment. The world is closing. People are afraid, and they will not put money on that in the moment. It's not the moment when the lockdown starts, and you never know if the shoemaker in the street will close the store, if he will be able to find the leather to build the shoes, if he will be able to play the employment and whatever. And you go and see him and say, listen, man, I give you $200 for the shoes, and you give me the shoes in 2 years. No, I take the shoes for the money. And I was extremely afraid about that last year, saying that en primeur is too dangerous, and we sold the wine in a couple of seconds. It was insane. So people still want to play that game if the price is the good and the quality is there. So the balance is quite, on my point of view, is quite easy to find. You know the price of your wine on the market, and you know the valorization of the wine and the increase of the price. And Chloe was speaking about Canon. Canon 15, you were able to buy a bottle en primeur at €75, and you not finding any bottle 150 or 200 now, a couple of years after. So of course it's interesting if you're in that dynamic.
So it seems like no change at Canon, Rauzan, Segla, or Berliquet for not removing yourself from the en primeur system this year or next. Well,
Tom, before you round up, I'm just going to make a statement for Chloe's more balanced statement that consumer opinion's divided, because I'm quite strongly of the view, that en primeur, yes, of course, it plays very heavily to a wide distribution of wine. It works for producers, but I don't think it works really as a wine collector or investor. And I think that I can buy good Italian wines that have had 4 years in bottle. We just launched San Leonardo 2016 a few weeks ago, and that's had all that time in bottle, plenty of time to review it. And I think over the years, maybe the edifice will crumble, but the correction in prices last year saved en primeur probably for another few years. So I'm going to be a bit more controversial and extreme. I agree with you, Chloe. I think opinions divided. It's not clear.
Yeah, but did you buy, Nathan, you just heard the example from Nicolas, did you buy the Canon 2015, which had some fairly good notes, to be honest?
Yes, but we're going to run out of time, Gavin. But if you look at a whole load of 2015s, 16s, and 18s of a variety of wines, and look at how much they've gone up since then, you've got a whole load of factors there to do with the quality of the wine, the changes in scoring once they were physical, and also the decrease in prices for 19 affected people who'd invested in wine in the years before, because it's brought down the perceived price of the wine. So it's pretty complicated.
I think this is definitely a topic which is a wonderful can of worms, and I think one which we could discuss at
a canon of worms.
A canon of worm. But I wanted to round up really with some thoughts from each of our panelists on the 2020 vintage, either as a whole with specific reference to your individual chateaus, or from the perspective of the market. Perhaps Chloe, we could start with you. Perhaps you could give us some general closing remarks on the 2020 vintage.
Sure, yes. I'm sadly not lucky to have tasted through a huge amount, but from what I've read and understood from other Wine Lister team members who have tasted, it's not quite as homogenous a vintage as last year, but there are some incredible wines to be had on both banks. Couple of things just from flipping what I have tasted and what I'll be buying. I promise I'm not saying this just because he's here, but Berliquet is stunning this year. La Font Rocher, beautiful as well at that level. And then, a couple of other gems, like Figeac is reportedly beautiful this year. But there's lots and lots and lots of great wines to be had across the board. And I think generally my comment about wines being able to be drunk for a longer period of time, so opened younger and still being extremely pleasurable, is definitely the case in 2020. I think from what I've tasted, some of the wines I could even drink now, even though they're unfinished. So it's certainly in a vintage that I'm buying into, for sure.
Thank you, Chloe. And Nicolas, what would your thoughts be on the 2020 vintage, having been making wine on both banks?
Yeah, we are lucky to be in Margaux and Saint-Emilion, so with an imported mix of Merlot, and Cabernet. I think this year probably the Merlot was a little bit more easy to manage because coming earlier, more juice. So the probably a risk of 2020 was the excess of concentration. So making the wine a little bit too rough and too tannic and too hard. So of course we had to be extremely gentle in terms of vinification, not to extract too much and not to go too far. So the Merlot helped us on that. So I have Merlot and in both Margaux and Saint-Emilion. So it was quite good for us. I love the vintage because it's ripe. It's a warm vintage, and you can feel it. You have the color, you have the intensity of the fruits, you have the softness of the tannin, that's gourmandise, but in the same time, very interesting freshness and vibration. So it's a great mix, and we of course it's coming from choices, viticulture choices, date of harvest, doing the thing a little bit earlier, being very soft in terms of vinification, but the result is extremely nice. And as Chloe said, the wine will be very easy to drink fast, but if the balance is well built, for example, I don't know if that's speaking to someone, but I have pH on the right bank on the limestone at 3.5. That's extremely low. That means that the level of acidity is extremely high for one vintage. So if you balance it properly, it's making something very, very nice in terms of tannins and freshness.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nicolas. And Gavin, you've mentioned a few chateaus that you've got your eye on this year, but again, more general comments about 2020 to round up.
I think, well, first you have to remember that it was an early harvest. That's quite an important thing. So most of the red grapes were picked in September, and then a very sunny vintage. But actually, you don't really feel so much that it's a sort of fruit bomby, exuberant sort of sunny vintage. In France, we use the word freshness, which doesn't translate quite so well, but the sort of vivacity, the freshness of the wines is really extraordinary. I think clearly it's a great vintage. For me, tasting everywhere, I think it's a great vintage in Saint-Emilion for sure. Of course, it's a very big appellation. So the easy thing to say is it's a heterogene, so it's uneven. It's a very easy thing to say that. So it's not as homogenous as 2019. It's not as consistent, but fantastic on the right bank. Pomerol obviously is very strong, and I think you'll continue to see a lot of very strong scores from critics in Pomerol, but much smaller production there and quite expensive. Great vintage in Pesset-Léognan for sure across the board. And people are saying it's not so. There is a lot of talk already about it being Merlot vintage and right bank, but don't underestimate the left bank. Don't underestimate, especially Saint-Estèphe. So I've mentioned a few already, fantastic wines there. And there is, I think these are wines to think about in some of the Pauillacs and Saint-Julians and so on. And I think there's fantastic, there are some, I think it's a very exciting vintage. I would like to definitely taste 15, 16, 18, 19 and 20 in bottle in about, a couple of years' time. Certainly there's so much to look forward to with that. I think it's a really, really interesting vintage, and not a fruit bomb or exuberant vintage, but a really classy vintage. I think it's a really exciting vintage.
Thank you very much indeed. I think we're all excited for what 2020 vintage holds. There's been a spate of releases, but we are only at the tip of the iceberg for the campaign, and it's certainly very encouraging to know that we've got a lot of great wine to come. Certainly from what I've been tasting, I echo so much of everything that the three of you have just said in terms of the freshness, the balance. There's an intensity to the wines. They're very, very drinkable, but you get no sense of that that it's lightweight. You know, that this open-ended drinking window seems to show the modern trend for winemaking to make wines that can be great in their youth and will evolve equally as greatly. So we're very, very excited by the vintage for sure.